Welcome to the Open Source Startup Podcast. As always, I'm one of your co-hosts, Robbie from Cowboy Ventures, and I'm joined by Tim Chen, my good friend, who is the general partner and founder of Essence VC. And today we're super excited to have an awesome guest, Mike Malone, who's founder and CEO of Smallstep, which is an automated certificate management company for DevOps teams. So welcome, Mike.
Hi, Robbie. Hi, Tim. Great to be here.
Awesome. So we always like to go way back to the beginning and start with the founding story and also the founding idea. So where did you get the idea for Smallstep? And is this what the initial idea was for the company, or did you iterate and this is kind of where you ended up?
Yeah, great question. Well, my background, I'm not a security person. And, what Smallstep does really is, up-leveling it a little bit is we help software development teams, IT teams, secure their software systems using TLS typically. And under the hood, we're doing certificate management. There's a form of credential management. But my background is not in cybersecurity. I'm a software engineer. I'm a nerd. I like to say my happy place is distributed systems architecture. I like building large software systems and building teams that are building large software systems. And that's been my background professionally and also just like as a hobby, even as a kid, I was a programmer, So the motivation for the company was really just solving pain points in building those large distributed systems. I've had a lot of professional experience doing that and saw a lot of the same problems coming up over and over again. And one of them is security, security. Securing these big distributed systems is challenging, especially when you sort of layer onto that sort of some of the more modern methodologies, philosophies around like agile and DevOps, lots of moving pieces, moving really quickly, changing really quickly, lots of people with like high authority access. So it's just a next level security problem. So layering in good controls without breaking everything and slowing everybody down is a big challenge. So that was the impetus. Did we have the right product right off the bat? No. We actually started out building an authorization product. So authorization being sort of like, whether a particular request should be allowed. And we started bringing that to market, is really cool technology. I mean, we basically wrote a programming language that has some like really neat characteristics that made it amenable to this problem space. And people liked it. Sort of fundamentally, like they were intrigued by it, but overwhelmingly the feedback we got was cool authorization product, but we don't have authentication yet, which is sort of like you need authentication to authorize. Like we had this thing that like microservice A is talking to microservice B, and microservice B could make a decision about whether that request should be allowed. But when a request came into microservice B, that microservice had no idea who was making the request. So authorization wasn't really useful. So customers are basically like, cool authorization product, go solve authentication for us, and then maybe we'll buy it, which is how we got to where we are right now.
So awesome. So I think we'd love to actually learn more because you have open source project. I saw Step CA, Step CLI. So I wonder, how do you start the journey of this? Did you start with open source projects and when to become like a more managed paid product, or what does that look like? Because like you said, you started with more with just like authorization and then moved back to authentication, right? And yeah, so I was wondering how that journey has been and how did you grow your initial open source project community as well?
Yeah, and we have a little bit of an unusual open source journey, I think, in that we created the open source project. A lot of open core companies, I think, grow out of open source projects that were created at some other company, sort of incubated. So we created this software from scratch, from the ground up. So there's a longer life cycle on that, I'll just say. But how we got there was, again, going back to what I was just saying about, is really about what the users, what the ecosystem wanted and needed. So when we started looking at this authentication problem, we did sort of a search of what's out there and what the options were. And ultimately we settled on like, well, for these distributed systems, the right default answer for security is probably this protocol called TLS. A lot of people are maybe familiar with TLS in that it's used in the web browser. So like when you go to google.com and you get that little lock icon, that means that the connection is secured using TLS, and Google has a certificate that's identifying themselves as google.com. You can also use TLS like everywhere else, like your microservice to microservice connections, or connecting to a database, or to an API or whatever. And all of that requires certificates as well. So we're looking at this and we're like, our customers just told us to go solve authentication. We sort of asked ourselves, well, how would we solve authentication in a large distributed system? The answer that we got to was TLS. TLS already exists. So why are they telling us that there's still a problem? And that's when we got to like, oh, okay, well, to use TLS, you need this special sort of credential called a certificate, X509 certificate. Certificate management is a special discipline. It's challenging, and importantly, they're the core infrastructure to do certificate management for the sorts of environments and users that we were focused on for cloud native DevOps. Just didn't exist. Like, again, pace and scale. Like, we needed to be able to issue like millions of certificates that were expiring, like very short-lived, and needed to be rotated like every few minutes or hours or whatever. So, and we wanted to build something that was ubiquitous, and core infrastructure for it to really be ubiquitous has to be open source. So ultimately, that's how we landed. There's like, I mean, part of it was just believing in open source as just generally a good thing, but also if we didn't open source this, somebody else would, right? So we'd prefer to also be the de facto open source solution. So that was part of the rationalization there.
So I want to double click on this statement of you finding out certificate management is hard. And so like, what was that process? And did you like, how many users or like potential users or customers did you talk to? And also like, what did you decide? So maybe this is a two-part question. What did you decide needed to be in the very first like release of the project?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm lucky in my background. I have a network of DevOps software engineer folks that I can talk to. So I was able to triangulate on what the issues were in this space pretty rapidly without having to do anything sort of unnatural or complicated in terms of outreach. And we had our users that we were already talking to about our previous product. So yeah, there was some triangulation that was done. But I had also lived this issue. At the last company I was at is a company called Bettable. It was a platform for online gambling. I was CTO there. And, we used to joke that we were regulated like a bank that sold liquor, because we were dealing with customer money, but it's also a vice industry. We can get a lot of empathy from regulators and stuff. So we had to tell a really compelling security story. We used TLS there. We had to invent a lot of tech there. So there are a lot of signals that we were able to pull from to sort of identify like there was a pain and what a solution looked like. Our focus on like what was included in MVP actually remains like really one of the headlines of what our differentiation is even today, is automation. To integrate into a DevOps workflow, you need secure automation, and that was a real gap in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's really intriguing, because I think a lot of security products, I think when we looked at maybe the last few years or 5-10 years, DevOps workflow isn't really part of it. But now we're seeing DevOps automation and workflow. Actually, not just security products, any products now in the infra space. You have DevOps workflow being a pretty native part of that. So maybe talk about like, what is that evolution or jump might look like? What is like a DevOps automation enabled product like this looks like? Is it the automation of the rotation of certificates that people had to roll by hand? That's really a part of it, or this is more tied to other DevOps tasks. So if people can feel like, maybe every release, there's some automated process to setting, the whole chain up. Yeah, well, just curious, like, how did you thought about this is how we stand out as a DevOps focused product and sell that to your customers?
Yeah, I think that's hard to answer totally generically. I think you have to kind of go to first principles. For us, it's automation is separate from it's its own lifecycle management, and that's really because that's one of the peculiar sort of challenges of certificate management is certificates. They're issued with a lifetime. So they may live a year more often. In like modern shops, they live much shorter lifetimes than that, like maybe down to an hour or minutes. And then so this is a credential that has a lifetime. And then the thing that's using that credential also has a lifetime, like a microservice or a database or something. It's everything's sort of ephemeral these days. So it might be spun up and spun back down, but that entity's lifetime is going to be different than the certificate's lifetime. So certificate lifecycle management exists as its own separate process, which is one of the complications here. So in a lot of cases, I would say like your best bet for automating is to sort of integrate with the existing automation tooling, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Terraform, build a Kubernetes operator, what have you. For certificates, you need to go a little bit deeper because these things don't sort of follow the life cycle of the other components.
So certificates, I believe, is your first project. And it's very popular now and has like a good amount of stars, momentum, traction. How long did that take? And like, did you release it and suddenly it got pretty wide adoption, or it's kind of this newer concept of automation? So like, what happened in the beginning? And maybe just walk us through like maybe the first couple moments where you're like, oh shit, this is really working.
Yeah. The community for our certificates project, which is our certificate authority, the core server, it's been growing steadily since launch. Our approach to growing that community has really been, I guess, like putting my CEO hat on content marketing, but like an honest and authentic form of that, really just teaching what we've been learning about the space, about what the hard parts are and how we've overcome them. So, right off the bat, we got some decent traction on the open source project because we put a lot of thought into announcing it to the world and explaining to people why we built it and what the core features were and what our vision for that product was. And we got some traction right off of that. And that's actually been a strategy that's worked for us a few times. In some cases, we'll do a content marketing piece before we even build something and do it as sort of a test of like, does this resonate? Do people click on this? Do they agree with it on Hacker News, or are they telling us there's 6 other existing solutions for it?
Yeah, and I think this space is really intriguing because I think lots of people have different options to do different things, right? It's not like we think of security just one way to do it, right? And so, I've noticed, searching for Smallstep and actually looking at how I see you're engaging in a community, started engaging in Hacker News comments. A lot of us, hey, here's an option to use it certificates, right, for 2FAing, right, or something like that. It's going to be interesting how you message Smallstep. It feels like the certificates. It's not just a mechanism how we do it, but like where you should do it, right? What other alternatives should we consider? What was your strategy like from the beginning to sort of like engage, or what kind of conversations? What were like some security topics or some security issues you started with, or did you start very specifically, hey, people are looking just for simpler certificate, like already the bottom's the solution, I just need to sell it, this is a much easier to do that?
I think the honest answer to that is that's hard, and I don't know that we're 100% perfect at like focusing on there. One of the challenges we have actually with our core technology is it's broadly horizontal. You can use it for a lot of different things, and it can be really hard to say no when somebody knocks on the door and says, "Hey, we're Big Co X, and we have a bazillion fobs that want to do Y, and you almost do it, but you don't quite do it. Can we force you to do it?" And I think we have learned to say no to that more often than not, or to at least like make it sort of a hard sell, convince us why we should do it. Because it turns out, I think a lot of people, while they say they want you to sort of reshape your product for their use case, they don't actually want that. They don't want that patience, and they don't want the square peg round hole result. But it is a challenge. So I think it's just good old fashioned diligence on, where people are, where the industry's headed, what the market sizes are. I don't know that I have any sort of like secret sauce to it beyond just, do your homework.
That makes sense. So I think wanted to ask you, because I was reading one of the case studies you have, right? And it talks about your customer started with StepCA as open source project, and then a long 3 paragraphs of how they actually try to productionize it, right? Set up Fargate, do this and that, and just like way too much work. So we just end up using your managed product instead. I think that was usually this challenge of any open source project is like your customers want to use, well, the good thing is they can just use open source project and get the value really quickly, but then also have to decide when I actually want to switch over to use a paid product. And so how you've been thinking about that? What is the value you want to be open source, and what are things you're not open sourcing, and able to have the good balance between that? How do you decide what that line is?
Yeah, that is also very tricky because we don't want to be shipping crippleware into open source. That's not the point. In fact, quite the opposite. Going back to the origin of all of this stuff, we saw like a real need for this new sort of core infrastructure. I like to say, certificate management is as ubiquitous as the database because it is how you secure connections to your database. So everybody running any sort of non-trivial software system ought to have this core infrastructure, and we want to be the ones providing it. So we do really and truly want to provide a solution that works for everybody, from people who can't afford or don't want to use our commercial offering all the way up to fully managed massive enterprise deploys. So that is a very tricky thing, deciding whether something should go into open source or not. Where we've landed on that for us is if it aligns to that like core infrastructure gap that we saw around like cloud native DevOps certificate management, and it's something that everybody needs, then it sort of aligns to best practices there, and everyone needs it, then it goes into open source. And that has led to some things that other software vendors who are open core have held back. For example, this is like very deeply technical, but there are these things called hardware security modules that can hold like private keys for signing things very securely. Like there's special hardware for that. And a lot of enterprise or a lot of open source software, like open core software, will hold back HSM integration. We haven't, because we think that's like critical for securing like a like high security PKI, which we believe everybody deserves to have. But if it's a feature that is really enterprise only, so think like a governance tool that really you only need if you have thousands of people who are trying to collaborate, or an audit tool that's only really relevant if you're going after like SOC 2 or FedRAMP or something like that, or a legacy feature. something that we don't think is modern and people should be like implementing today, greenfield, like active revocation mechanisms in the case of like our product offering. Again, pretty nerdy, but this is something that like we don't preach as best practice. Nevertheless, it is a requirement for various compliance, enterprise policy reasons, or to support legacy infrastructure. That's the sort of stuff that we're like, hey, well, great, we'll do it and we'll charge you for it. That'll go in our commercial offering. There's also just a lot of supporting stuff around the certificate authority, like the core thing that we're building, audit, logging, more granular access controls, and just lots of sort of bells and whistles and integrations and stuff like that, that end up they're building on that core open source project, sort of building around it, that differentiate commercial.
I really like that framing of whether it's something that everybody's going to use or a subset of enterprise. And I think this question of what to charge for versus what to leave open source, it's something that every open source founder struggles with. And if you have a misstep on it, then it can have huge consequences to just how your community views you. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about your journey as a venture-backed company. And when you went out to raise your first round, what did you have at that point? And kind of maybe talk about what was hard about raising your first venture round and what were some of the things that you learned?
Well, for me, that was a while ago. We raised our first round in 2016, but I didn't have much at the time, in one sense. And I guess in another sense, I had a lot. I guess I had a deck and I had my background. And I think it turns out those are pretty key pieces to raising a seed round. What I tell sort of new entrepreneurs who are asking, like, what should I focus on? I think what seed round investors focus on is like they don't expect product market fit yet. They look for a venture scale opportunity. So like, is there a problem that is solvable now? And, is it big enough? Is there can I squint and see a total addressable market that's venture scale, which is going to mean, at least say like 100 million ARR. There at least potential of that. So that's the first thing. Like, is there a market? And then is there founder market fit? Is this the founder that I want to, bet on to address this market? So I didn't know that going into it. I did learn that, and it turns out I was lucky to have that going for me with my background. I think that's why VCs love the, like, I'm solving a problem I've experienced before pitches, because it speaks to founder market fit. So we didn't have a product, we didn't have running software. I didn't really have I had some people who had said, like, if you raise money, I'll join you, but I didn't have a team. So it was early, it was a deck and a pitch, and that's pretty much it.
And so I'm really curious, because your first round is at 2016 or 2017, right? And then you only raised your next round 2022. So that's like a 5 to 6 year span. And most startups couldn't live that long. Usually you raise for like a 2-year runway unless you have revenue. And so I'm just curious, like, how did you get it through for 6 years? Did you have revenue to sustain you, or was there any difficult or even things you learned able to run a company with one round of funding for that long?
Well, I'm definitely a believer in running lean for as long as you can and to scale when you're breaking. Yeah, that helped. I mean, our expenses, especially for the first couple of years, were just very, very low. Yeah, we had some revenue. And we also had some support from insiders in between there. So that wasn't the only money that came in between 2017 and 2022.
So would love to maybe get more detail on what keeping your team lean looked like. Like, are these all straight engineers? Did you have someone who is more on the developer advocate side, or were all kind of technical folks also doing that role as well? Like, what did that look like? And maybe what were 1 or 2 game-changing hires that you made?
The early hires were all engineers, and they're all game-changing hires at that scale. I mean, we had some really awesome software engineers who joined early on, who were very experienced and also have a product mindset and like an entrepreneurial mindset. Following on that, I mean, I tried to do jobs as best I could before hiring for them. So like one of the things I delegated medium early is some of the content work, because I wanted to scale that out. And I think I'm decent at it, but it also takes me a long time. So I wanted to be able to focus on some other stuff. So yeah, we had a developer advocate, content person who was there. They had a very squishy role to just, be a creative and go and, take the pulse of the community and see how you can connect it back to our vision and our story and write interesting stuff about it. And that's a weird role, especially when you're talking about running lean, but that was basically marketing, and hard to measure. Like, there's no attribution in that sort of marketing, but I'm like, it's zero question in my mind whether that was ROI positive. After that, I mean, it's only been really very recent, since we raised our A, that we've been like really fleshing out the other orgs, post sales, customer success, product, sales. We just hired a head of sales like 6 weeks ago, which has been great, by the way. He's awesome, and it's really changing things. So yeah, I mean, I don't think you need a lot to get things off the ground. In fact, I think it's good to hold off on some of that stuff and do the jobs yourself.
So yeah, I'm curious to actually ask about your content, because I'm looking at sort of like the content your DevRel person's Carl, right? And also the sort of content you've written. A lot of it has oriented like, how do you set up like SSH? How do you set up your own CAs? Like a lot of like different scenarios. How do you start to do something? But there's also there's some interesting content, like the poetic naming of CLIs, or some really interesting, like even reflective type of content I saw. What is called cheating my way to success or something like that. I guess what is sort of the philosophies of some of these contents, and what are kind of experiments you tried that really, surprised you? It's like, oh wow, this actually worked really well.
I think there are one thing I've sort of come to believe in content creation is there are different sorts of content, and it's important to understand what sort of content you're creating when you're creating it. So there's stuff like feature announcements. And unless you're like GitHub or Apple or someone like that, that's for your existing customers, and you probably don't have enough of those that it's realistically going to like make it to the front page of Hacker News or something like that. And that's okay. Like, that is what it is. You write it anyways, you put it out there. There are tutorials, onboarding content that's really about like, somebody's already found my product and now they're trying to get started. Again, probably not going to perform well on like the Orange website. But then there's like, so I think this is why you're seeing that mix, right? So we do that content. You have to do that content, tutorials, like intros to the product and updates and whatnot. And then there's like this category of really open-ended, like creative content. Like one bit of content that has performed, like one of the best pieces of content that we have on our blog is Carl, who his new title is actually off-road engineer, but he used to be developer advocate. He created this like image of OpenSSL as a GUI. So it's like a graphical user interface with like a bazillion tabs and everything. And it he pasted it like an internal Slack, and I was like, that's awesome. It's our voice. It speaks to the problem that we're solving. It's silly, but it's authentic. And it did make it to the top of Hacker News, and we got a bazillion clicks. That stuff you can't really plan. You have to just give people space and permission to do it. And it doesn't happen on a schedule. And you have to nurture it. It's creative. So if you're lucky, you'll have something that you can maybe shepherd and just sort of tie in back to something that's relevant for your product or for your company in some small way. That's timely, but it's more opportunistic and creative than that. So yeah, every piece of content has a purpose, and that's I think how that's been successful for us.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think content is one of the most underutilized tactics for anything that's community based, which obviously all of open source ends up being. I wanted to talk about other kind of community management, and also just how you even measured the quality of the community early on before you had something paid, because it's one of the challenges with open source is sometimes you don't really know. You could just have a bunch of users that will never pay you anything because they're just, with this use case, you assume that there are companies that could pay, but how did you even manage? I saw that you guys have a Gitter channel, but where do you kind of manage your community, and how did you measure the quality of it?
Yeah, we have a bunch of tools we use. We don't use Gitter anymore. We use Discord now. So yeah, there's chat there. We use GitHub discussions. Obviously, there's GitHub issues and PRs and stuff. Stargazers and Twitter, and we use Orbit to get some semblance of a handle on what's going on in all of those different communities. But open source is hard. Sometimes I refer to it as crappy product led. It's got some of the characteristics of a freemium or a free tier, but without the relationship and without the data that you get from somebody who's actually signed up for a SaaS product and is using it. And especially as a security product, we've been really reluctant. We don't do any instrumentation at all of our open source, zero. So we have almost no information on who is using our open source unless they tell us, or if we break something and they open an issue. So, that results in lots of jokes internally about maybe we should just push more bugs. And we can see large organizations using our stuff sort of indirectly, right? We'll see referral traffic from internal Atlassian, and our pixel trackers will identify 1,000 sessions from big company X. So it's challenging. Open source is challenging, but also our entire commercial pipeline is inbound, right? And that's coming from somewhere. That's coming from content and open source. So it does seem to do what it's supposed to do, which is reduce your customer acquisition cost and help with brand awareness. So I guess it's pros and cons. Definitely evolving story there. It's hard.
Yeah, I think this open source journey, we talk to so many companies, everyone have their own reaction. Some even quit, not going to start any open source company again. But we definitely use, as you mentioned, if it works beautifully. When you're inbound, definitely comes a lot from the community. What are the challenges you have to learn, I guess, because we talked a little bit about figuring out the journey of changing your products, right? Figuring out how to build an open source space, a project and company. What were the things you had, the biggest challenge you have to overcome sort of as a founder? I guess more of a personal journey. What have you learned? Maybe open source related or not, right? Yeah. That you have to learn over this time to up level the company.
the hardest thing for me personally has been delegating technical decisions, because I am an engineer and that is my background and I like it. And I think, I'm decent at it. So like all those factors that make delegating hard. So that has been a huge challenge for me. And it's really probably only been in like the last year or so that I feel like I've more complete, and I haven't completely delegated stuff. I definitely am still involved in things that I probably shouldn't be involved in. But that's been hard. But necessary. As I've now started to delegate more of that, the pace has increased because I've been a bottleneck. And not only am I like a bottleneck, but it's hard for people to push back when I'm making a bad decision because I'm CEO. And it doesn't scale. And I have other things that I need to be doing. So there's no continuity. One week I'm really invested in it. The next I have to go and deal with, SOC 2 compliance or something that has to get done that is completely irrelevant to engineering lifecycle management. So I've definitely begun to see myself as like not really doing any one particular thing, but trying to be a force multiplier for the people who do. But that has been like there's a learning curve to that.
Yeah, you highlighted something that we hear from a lot of our founders and CEOs, and that you're just, especially if you are a domain expert, so oftentimes in anything that's technically oriented, you're an engineer before, you start having done all these other functions that you're not necessarily an expert in, and you're just constantly doing all of these other things other than building, which you were doing up front. I guess maybe off of that has the founder journey so far been what you imagined it would be? Has it been better or worse? Or in some ways, did you kind of have a sense for what it was going to be like?
I kind of did, just because my whole career has been at startups. This is the first one I've been the founder CEO of, but I've been at early stage startups since the very beginning of my career. So I had a pretty good sense of it, but there's some things that you just can't prepare for. I mean, it's an emotional roller coaster running a company. And it's also like, people joke about, it's nice to have no boss, but you don't not have a boss. In fact, you have like sort of everyone's your boss. You have a lot of stakeholders that like, if you have any sort of moral integrity at all, you're going to feel real obligation towards, including investors, employees, obviously, like customers. Like these are all now people that you need to respond to. And you have limited feedback in terms of like what success looks like. It's hard when you are defining the objective and then executing against it, because even when you hit that objective, you still have this like nagging question of like, was it the right objective, right? Whereas like if you're just executing on someone else's vision, if you do it, you've done your job, and you can feel good about it. So yes and no. I mean, yes, I sort of knew what I was signing up for, but there's some things that like the emotions are hard to simulate,
Yeah, that's definitely a really odd journey for most, especially engineers going to founders too, where they definitely have no muscle in some other areas. That was my own journey actually as well. But this is fantastic, conversations. We learned a ton. So, thanks so much for being on and talking about all this related stuff. And it's super excited to see Smallstep and Step CA, all of the continuous success over there as well.
Thank you. It's been tons of fun.